Listen to these chilling words by the United States Naval Institute, or USNI. One moment she was a ship teeming with life, humming with activity. Seconds later, she was a vast black billowing bier, which momentarily marked the spot where 350 U.S. Navy men perished without a trace. What the USNI is describing with those words is what took place on November 10, 1944, off Manus Island in the Pacific Ocean. The event was a massive explosion on an ammunition ship, the USS Mount Hood. The result was one of the worst non-combat-related catastrophes in U.S. Navy history. Let's learn more about an explosion so massive that it obliterated a ship and everyone on board and caused a whole lot of other destruction. The USS Mount Hood, designated as AE-11, was an ammunition ship in the United States Navy during World War II. However, she started life as a cargo ship named Marco Polo, being built by the North Carolina Shipbuilding Company in Wilmington, North Carolina. The U.S. Navy requisitioned her on a loan charter basis, and she was renamed USS Mount Hood on November 10, 1943, almost 2 years after the United States had entered World War II. She was named after Mount Hood, a stratovolcano in the Cascades mountain range of Oregon. Naming ammunition ships after volcanoes is a tradition in the U.S. Navy. Mount Hood was finally commissioned as ready for active service on July 1, 1944. Being designated as an AE-class ship meant that her primary role was the handling, transportation, and delivery of ammunition and explosives where needed. Unsurprisingly, her missions were of immense importance in the middle of a world war. This was especially true as the U.S. was ramping up its efforts to finally defeat Japan in the Pacific Ocean. She was essentially a floating arsenal, transporting everything from small arms ammunition to larger caliber gun shells, bombs, and various other ordnances. Ammunition ships obviously had to prioritize both capacity and safety, allowing for large amounts of explosives and ammunition to be transported, while mitigating the risk of accidental explosions on board. Nevertheless, these were innately highly hazardous vessels, especially in war zones. The USS Mount Hood was involved in routine but critical operations in Seeadler Harbor in Manus Island, which is in the Admiralty Islands chain and is today part of Papua New Guinea. Seeadler Harbor was always bustling with Allied activity, being a large natural harbor with an ideal location in the Pacific Ocean war theater. It was an ideal staging and supply midway point for naval units throughout the Pacific. By the way, the name Manus Island might ring a bell to some of our listeners. That's because it was the site of a notorious detention center for refugees run by Australia on the island from 2001 to 2017. But back to the war. Seeadler Harbor on the morning of November 10, 1944, was bustling with the usual flow of naval vessels, which typically included battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and various cargo-related ships and support vessels. One couldn't have picked a busier, even chaotic location for a sudden violent maritime explosion. On that day, the USS Mount Hood had nearly 3,800 tons of ordnance on board. This cargo included 100 and 250-pound bombs, multiple depth charges, and 30 caliber, 50 caliber, and 20 millimeter round naval shells. All the ship's hatches were open that morning as it was receiving a large consignment of 500-pound bombs. Suddenly, and without any warning whatsoever, she blew up at precisely 8:03. The amount of munitions aboard or being transferred onto the ship meant it was like a giant bomb went off. The explosion was so massive that all 350 officers and men on board were instantly killed. The only surviving crew from the USS Mount Hood were 5 crewmen and an officer who had gone ashore to collect the ship's mail, including 2 crew members who were on their way to the brig in order to be court-martialed. She'd been anchored in very shallow water at a depth of approximately 35 feet or 10.6 meters. The explosion was of such enormity that it blasted a trench in the bottom of the harbor. Divers would later report that the trench was approximately 1,000 feet or 305 meters in length, 200 feet or 61 meters in width, and a quite astounding 85 feet or 26 meters at its deepest. The Mount Hood was so obliterated by the sheer violence of the blast that the only significant part later found was a 100-foot wide piece of the hull found in that trench caused by the explosion. Metal fragments raining down on or striking other vessels were the other remnants of a once large ship. The only other remnant of the USS Mount Hood were a few tattered pages of a signal notebook found floating on the water. No human remains, nothing else. That was it. The harbor was very busy that morning, and so there are many witnesses to the explosion and its immediate aftermath. Many people described a massive upsurge of water and a towering 7,000-foot or 2,135-meter column of billowing smoke and fire. One intelligence officer on land described a meeting he was in suddenly being interrupted by a tremendous boom, likening it to a gigantic bass drum a mile in diameter being struck hard. He recalled how the ground shook like an earthquake, followed by a pillar of blue-gray smoke expanding and rising into the cloudless sky up to a mile in height. A striking feature of the explosion, noted by some witnesses, was of what seemed like a burst of lightning flashing upwards from the USS Mount Hood. An interesting aside regarding this upward flash of what looked like lightning a split second before the explosion has to do with another horrendous explosion that occurred during World War I. That explosion took place in the port of Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada, on December 6, 1917. A French vessel laden with explosives, the SS Mont Blanc, collided with the SS Imo, a Norwegian ship, in Halifax Harbor. The resulting blast was so huge that it destroyed the Richmond district of Halifax, with nearly 1,800 people killed from the blast, fires, falling debris, or collapsed buildings. 9,000 more were injured. It was the largest human-made explosion ever at that time, and would remain so until the explosion of the atom bomb over Hiroshima 28 years later. The explosion from the USS Mount Hood at Manus Island on that November day in 1944 was eerily similar, as a similar upward flash had been observed in Halifax all those years before. A number of nearby ships and vessels were slammed hard by the explosion, some as far as 6,000 feet or over 1,800 meters away. That's almost 2 kilometers or a mile distant. A shower of metal and other debris rained across the harbor, causing extensive collateral damage to ships, as well as many injuries and deaths on other vessels. The force of the Mount Hood's explosion and the resulting flying fragments of metal from Mount Hood smashed into some 30 other ships and vessels in the harbor. Many men on other vessels were killed by flying debris, while scores of others sank with some of the small craft that were torn asunder by the blast. Hundreds more men were flung into the water and had to be rescued, most of them covered in oil. The worst hit of them all was the USS Mindanao, a patrol craft tender that was in closest proximity to the Mount Hood. Every single crewman who was topside on the Mindanao was instantly killed, together with dozens of men below deck. 82 men lost their lives on the USS Mindanao, with a further 100 injured. One tragic story that day was of a Mount Hood sailor who had not been on board because he happened to be visiting friends on another ship when the explosion occurred. Unfortunately, that ship was the USS Mindanao, and he was struck and killed by flying debris from his own ship when he rushed to the deck to see what was going on. Talk about a sick twist of fate. A total of 22 small craft were sunk or damaged beyond repair due to the blast. That included 9 medium landing crafts, or LCMs, as well as 13 small boats or landing craft. Also destroyed was a pontoon barge that had been moored alongside the USS Mount Hood to facilitate deliveries on and off the ship. 18 larger ships in the harbor were damaged to some extent. Ships with fairly extensive damage to them included the escort carriers USS Saginaw Bay and USS Petroff Bay. There was devastation, too, in the immediate surroundings. Buildings and other infrastructure on land were also heavily impacted, including docks, warehouses, and other naval facilities. The explosion was indeed immense, but why was it so destructive? The location of the USS Mount Hood in the harbor was a decisive factor in the blast taking out or damaging so many ships. She was anchored right in the middle of a gaggle of ships and other vessels of the 7th Fleet Service Force. Had Mount Hood been anchored instead at the ammunition supply depot at Lugos, which was the customary anchorage spot for ammunition ships at Manus Island, then she would have been far more isolated from other ships. It does seem rather crazy that a ship so heavy with explosive ordnances should have been anchored slap-bang in the middle of the harbor, surrounded by so many other vessels. Having said that, it would have been far worse had the disaster taken place a month earlier when the harbor was filled with much larger vessels belonging to the 7th Fleet. As many as 995 ships were located in Seeadler Harbor in mid-October 1944. One can only imagine what type of devastation to life and vessel a massive explosion then would have caused. But what was the actual cause of a huge explosion that caused so much damage and death? Was it the Japanese? The Japanese were indeed very aware of Manus Island's importance to the Allied naval effort. Reconnaissance by Japanese airplanes over the island had been observed just the day before. There was a suggestive radio broadcast in English transmitted from Tokyo at noon that day, less than 4 hours after the explosion. It proclaimed, "An American battleship was blown up in Manus Harbor this morning." Some analysts noted how the Japanese used the term "was blown up," which seemed to implicate them in the disaster, instead of neutral terms like blew up or exploded. Then again, one can't read too much into just those words. The 1800 hours broadcast from Tokyo later that same day repeated the story, and named a list of other ships which had been damaged, including the USS Mindanao. Again, one cannot read too much into that, given that the airwaves emitting from the island that day would have been jammed full of urgent transmissions about ships going down and sailors needing assistance. The most decisive proof that the Japanese had nothing to do with the explosion is that no unidentified objects had been picked up that morning by sonic detection gear. Said detection gear at the harbor entrance control post on Admiralty Island came up negative on that score. Furthermore, anti-torpedo nets had anyway been stretched across the channel into Seeadler Harbor on the night before, as was routine. A far more likely reason for the explosion later transpired, when it became known that many of the crew on Mount Hood had been careless in their handling of explosives. For example, surviving crew members admitted that sling loads of ammunition had struck against the side of the ship on more than one occasion. It makes sense. Something had to cause the explosion. Unlike the even bigger explosion that occurred in Halifax, which was caused by a collision between two ships, there was no such collision with the USS Mount Hood. Nor was there any earthquake, seaquake, or any other freak event that caused disturbance to the ship's cargo. Poor handling or incorrect storage of what were highly hazardous ordnances makes a lot more sense. A board of investigation on the USS Sierra was immediately convened after the explosion. Evidence and the testimonies of multiple witnesses were gathered over a month. Attack by either enemy submarine or aircraft was ruled out. The possibility of static electricity or friction accidentally igniting the munitions on board was deliberated. Fire was also offered as a possible cause, although there was no fire observed on the ship before the explosion, so that was unlikely. Other possible causes considered by the board included that a TPX-loaded depth bomb struck a hatch while being loaded into the number 3 or 4 hold. Another cause pondered was that pyrotechnics and napalm gel incendiaries were stowed out in the open on deck under hazardous conditions. Rough handling generally of munitions in all parts of the ship was also considered, as was the incorrect storage of munitions. In its final deliberation, however, the Board of Investigation found that the explosion occurred due to unknown accidental causes. Even Fleet Admiral Nimitz went to great lengths to state how the explosion was not due to negligence, but rather errors in judgment by officers who were keen to do their bit for the war effort. Yeah, right. Still, the U.S. Navy would later release a series of rules regarding how explosives and other hazardous munitions need to be stored, handled, and transported. Sadly, the new rules came too late for the cargo ship, the USS Serpens. It exploded and sank off Lunga Point in Guadalcanal in the Pacific on January 29, 1945, less than 2 months after the Mount Hood tragedy. The massive blast on Serpens killed 255 men, including 196 Coast Guardsmen. All too often, it takes the ravages of war for operational mistakes to finally be rectified. That was certainly the case with the USS Mount Hood.